Is this now an open door for U.S. interventionism from here on out, or is this something very different? So what is the Donroe Doctrine, which is a combination, of course, of Donald Trump and Monroe Doctrine? Is it just a reformulation of an ideological kind of impetus for America getting involved in foreign conflicts? Or is it closer in spirit to the original Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which really was quite limited in its aims and was not intended to create virtuous liberal democratic regimes throughout the Western Hemisphere? Trump surprised me. He surpassed expectations. It's a new year, and the United States has a new foreign policy doctrine, the Donroe Doctrine, which President Trump promulgated after a very successful operation in Venezuela, where U.S. Special Forces intervened over the course of about 2.5 hours and were able to capture Nicolás Maduro, the president of Venezuela, and bring him to the United States, where he will face trial in New York. Now, this obviously is something that raises deep questions about the nature of sovereignty. Many critics of this operation are saying that President Trump violated Venezuela's sovereignty, perhaps violated international law by undertaking this operation. There's also a question, of course, about what this says in terms of America's foreign policy vision. Do we think that we have a responsibility to police at least our own hemisphere, at least the Americas? Do these responsibilities then extend beyond the Americas to perhaps other parts of the world? In which case, President Trump and his MAGA foreign policy might very well wind up in the end embracing a policy that looks a lot like what had been followed by George W. Bush or by other Republican leaders, and in fact many Democratic leaders as well, during the Cold War and afterwards. Is this now an open door for U.S. interventionism from here on out, or is this something very different? Is the Donroe Doctrine, in fact, closer to the original Monroe Doctrine of 1823, promulgated by President James Monroe, which had this view of quite limited U.S. interests within the Americas, within Latin America in particular, that would be pursued by keeping European powers from intervening within our own backyard. And there are many big questions here about the very purpose of foreign policy itself, especially as the United States in its very earliest years had to deal with a rapidly changing world of superpowers and ideological movements that was being formed in the wake of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. So let's begin by revisiting the Monroe Doctrine itself. Under President Monroe, this doctrine is put forth in 1823. It's actually written by James Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. And it says basically two things. The first is that the United States will discourage and discountenance any establishment of new European colonies within the New World. It basically says that the New World is now closed to the establishment of new European footholds and colonies. It also says that the United States will discountenance and oppose any attempt by European powers to reestablish colonies in the New World that have revolted against European rule. So if you have Spanish colonies in Latin America that have revolted against Spain, the United States says Spain should keep its hands off and should not try to reassert its power. Obviously, there's a sense in which the United States itself is an example of a European colony which revolted against its motherland and now continues to assert its independence. The United States had been a colony of Great Britain, and the United States obviously was not looking for Great Britain to reestablish its power over the U.S. Now, note what the Monroe Doctrine did not say. The Monroe Doctrine was not primarily ideological. It did not specify that the United States expected to see certain kinds of governments in Latin America or elsewhere in the Americas. It did not say that even colonialism itself was something that the United States would necessarily oppose in terms of trying to get rid of existing European colonies in Latin America. It was only the establishment of new colonies, the expansion of European power, or the retaking of colonies that had revolted that the United States stated would be opposed by its policy in the Americas and in this hemisphere in general. Basically, the James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and the United States were trying to draw some limits on not only the colonial policies, but also the revolutionary politics of Europe. It had been a considerable difficulty for the United States in its first few administrations under Washington and Adams and Jefferson on into the Madison administration before James Monroe, where the United States had to keep out of this massive, world war which had begun in Europe with the French Revolution. And so there were elements in America that wanted to side with the English against the revolutionary French. There were other elements, including Thomas Jefferson, who had many more sympathies for the revolutionary French and who saw the French Revolution as being necessary for the happiness of humanity, as being something that would bring a greater degree of freedom to the entire world, and generally as being a very good thing. Yet even Jefferson realized that the United States should not get directly involved in supporting the French Revolution and in the attempts of France to export its revolution through military force to the rest of Europe and then potentially to the world even beyond Europe. So whether or not you had a John Adams who was quite sympathetic to the English and very critical of the French Revolution, or a later president like Thomas Jefferson who was sympathetic to the French, in both cases, the administrations in early America tried to keep the United States out of Europe's conflicts. They didn't want to see us get involved in either set, of alliances, either those that were against the revolution and pro-English, or that were in favor of the French Revolution and that were aligned with France. And the United States had a number of policies designed to keep us neutral. Now, that was not an easy thing to do because, the question becomes, are we having trade with one party or another? Trade with one of these elements within this war? Trade with one country or another? Did that make us a party to the war itself? So Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, their approach to trying to maintain American neutrality was to have an embargo on trade with these European belligerents. Now, of course, that meant that the United States federal government was using its own force to try to prevent us from having a high degree of, trade involvement with these warring countries in France. We also had to worry about, especially, during the early phase of the Revolutionary War, the French Revolution, but even, going on over the course of several years, there was a problem where the British Navy kept impressing Americans, kept abducting them and forcing them to serve on British ships. So John Adams and successive presidents had to prevent the British from continuing to impress Americans to serve on British ships. This was something that meant that sometimes we had battles with the British in order to prevent this. Nevertheless, this was not aimed at trying to enter the war. It was aimed at trying to keep us out of it. Now, a little bit later, as we get to the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, the United States was still very concerned about the possibility that Europe would be divided between monarchical powers, traditionalist powers, conservative powers, however you might want to style them, reactionary powers perhaps, and progressive powers, revolutionary powers, which would try to promote not only a greater degree of liberalism, as liberalism was understood in the 19th century, but a greater degree of revolutionary fervor, and they would try to bring about more liberal and democratic governments in Europe by basically subverting existing monarchies and even in some cases constitutional systems that were not perhaps progressive enough for those who wanted to see Europe adopt the values of the French Revolution. And there was a great danger that perhaps this European situation, this division of Europe into these two competing ideological blocs, traditionalists or reactionaries or conservatives on the one hand, revolutionaries, progressives, liberals on the other, that this conflict would then be exported to the New World as well, and perhaps would influence the United States in particular. So the United States wanted to keep the New World isolated from that kind of ideological pollution from Europe. There was also, of course, an existing concern about European imperial policy, that the United States did not want to see a sort of reinvigorated European colonialism in the New World, taking the form of new colonies being founded, or Spain or other European powers cracking down on colonies that had revolted and trying to bring them back into their empires. This idea of imperial growth, not just the existence of empire, not just the existence of colonies, but rather the idea of European power growing and trying to add to the complexities of the New World. That was what the United States was trying to oppose in the 19th century, in 1823, with the Monroe Doctrine. It's worth noting, by the way, the Monroe Doctrine, as I say, was written by John Quincy Adams, who was Monroe's Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams, 2 years earlier, in 1821, on July 4th, gave a very important set of remarks about American foreign policy. It's a famous speech in which he uses the phrase that America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And he said that America wishes well to any country that might be revolting against imperial power, revolting against colonialism. Greece, for example, in Europe, was an example of a European country that was actually revolting against Ottoman imperial authority. So it's not just a question of whether European countries have colonies in the New World. It was also those elements within Europe which were colonized either by and under the imperial power of the Ottomans, or perhaps were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. America was trying to say that, we wish well to anyone who wants to do what we did and try to revolt against imperial rule and try to claim independence, try to claim self-government. We were happy to say that we hope that you succeed. But that did not mean that their wars were our wars and that we had to commit our resources to fighting their battles. Now, I mentioned that you had this sort of division of Europe into two camps. This was not only a matter of different countries being in each camp. Within each country, you also had these divisions, including in Britain. And there was very much a debate in Britain about the nature of Britain's foreign policy in the early 19th century, and indeed throughout the 19th century. Conservatives tended to say that Britain's foreign policy should be quite limited, that Britain should be an offshore balancer, that Britain should try to prevent any power on the continent of Europe from gaining absolute supremacy over the rest of the continent. Generally, France was the primary concern there. As you get into the 20th century, Germany will increasingly be the country that Britain is most concerned about. But in general, conservatives said that England should have a policy of what comes to be called splendid isolation. Now, that may seem surprising to Americans because, of course, Britain all throughout this time had an empire. Britain was in charge of India. Britain had possessions all around the world. So splendid isolation is a strange thing for British conservatives to talk about in terms of British foreign policy. But the idea was that Britain would not be drawn into these conflicts on the European continent between revolutionary forces, between new forms of nationalism that were taking rise in Europe, oftentimes in revolution against imperial overlordship. Britain did not want to get involved in the internal politics of all these countries. In fact, even at times during the 19th century, Britain wound up being an ally, either de facto or explicitly, an ally of the Ottoman Empire. This was because Britain, primarily when it was governed by conservatives, had a desire to see order in Europe and a desire to see peace, and to see, a limitation on the rise of any great power rival. Those were the limited aims that conservatives had in British foreign policy in the 19th century. Now, on the other side, you had British liberals and British Whigs who wanted to see a much more moralistic foreign policy. They thought that Britain should use its massive amount of power, especially its naval power, in order to promote liberalism and democracy all throughout the European continent, in order to throw England's traditions of liberty and its military power behind independence movements that were trying to overthrow the yoke of the Ottoman Empire and other forms of imperial overlordship. Now, this debate gets transplanted to the United States, and you have certain Americans who say, you know what, we sympathize with those British liberals and those British Whigs who say that, yes, the English-speaking world, which is a model of liberty for the entire planet, it should not just be a model, it should not just be a shining city on a hill that represents a beacon to humanity, but that we actually have a duty to go out there and use our own blood and treasure, use our own military power to try to promote our values, our way of life, our form of government all around the world, and certainly to encourage and help any kind of revolutionary movement, be it in Greece or be it in the New World. The Monroe Doctrine didn't do that. The Monroe Doctrine, in fact, was quite conservative in its outlook. It said we were not, as the United States, going to try to provoke revolution on the part of Spanish colonies in Latin America. We were not going to try to say that these colonies should revolt and claim independence. As long as the situation stayed in the status quo, that was acceptable to us. And it was really up to Latin American countries themselves to decide whether they were going to have a revolution. And if they did, it was really on them to have it. And we would prevent, the reassertion of European power or the growth of European power in the New World. But we would not try to eject it to begin with. And this was a matter of both principle and also realistic practice. Well, then you might ask, well, why does the United States get involved in things like the Spanish-American War towards the end of the 19th century? And then, of course, we get involved in both world wars, in World War I and in World War II. Why is that? Why do we have this dramatic change in American foreign policy? Or is it a change? Is this, in fact, consistent with our older, our older wisdom in foreign policy, which had been bequeathed to us not only by, the Monroe Doctrine and by John Quincy Adams, but that in fact really goes all the way back to George Washington at the very founding of our nation. Well, the great historian, who in fact is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, Walter McDougall, argues that America did indeed have a massive change in its foreign policy outlook at the end of the 19th century, that we shifted from an Old Testament foreign policy, as McDougall calls it, where we were basically largely non-interventionist, not perfectly non-interventionist, but we certainly did not see ourselves as having a sort of destiny to change the world using military force. That was our Old Testament foreign policy, which gave way, according to Walter McDougall, to a more evangelical kind of New Testament foreign policy aimed at spreading American values and constitutionalism through the use of military force. And the watershed, really the pivotal episode in that change, is the Spanish-American War of the 1890s. And that is a conflict in which you have a very outspoken American press. They're called yellow journalism. It's a very, inflammatory and jingoistic form of journalism, which was basically ginning up a war where America was going to get involved, was going to intervene in order to liberate Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and also the Philippines, and that we were then going to oversee and help to democratize and liberalize these former Spanish possessions. It becomes a very ideological rush to war in the 1890s. And basically, those who believe in a more liberal or liberal democratic or evangelistic kind of foreign policy. And again, I'm using evangelistic in a political sense, not a religious sense, although it is, it does have a lot of the same fervor and intensity that you find in religions. This, pro-imperial, this pro-expansionist foreign policy was seen as being actually anti-imperial because it was opposing the Spanish Empire. And it was seen as being something that would bring the glories of American constitutionalism, liberalism, democracy, and also Protestantism, for that matter, to the Philippines and to Cuba and to other states in in the Caribbean and Latin America. So it was very much all about trying to promote a form of government, a way of life, even a religion that Americans approved of, as opposed to what was seen as being the ideological antithesis of America in Spain. Spain was the place of the Spanish Inquisition. Spain was monarchical. Spain was Catholic. All of these things were seen as being basically demonic characteristics of Spain, and that as soon as Spanish power was overthrown in Cuba or in the Philippines or elsewhere, then you would have conditions that would be propitious for the rise of a good American-style constitutionalism that was liberal and democratic and informed by good Protestant values rather than by the power and oppression of the Spanish Inquisition. Those were the ideological terms in which the Spanish-American War was framed in the 1890s. And they wound up, if you think about it, these are the same ideological terms that continue to be applied, in American foreign policy by people who really want to see America have an idealistic, interventionist policy all around the world. So every time that we no longer worry about the Black Legend and the menace of Catholic monarchy. We don't talk about that anymore. But we do talk about, dictatorships and ideological, extremism on the right or on the left, fascism or communism. All these things are being seen as not only the justification for America getting involved in things like the World Wars, but all of these smaller conflicts that we've been involved in over the years as well. The Iraq War, for example, in 2003, was framed in terms of America liberating Iraq, not only from Saddam Hussein as a dictator, but from this ideology of what was being called by propagandists at the time, Islamo-fascism. So even that war, where we're facing, this Ba'athist regime, had to be reframed in terms of this battle between good and evil, which in political terms is a battle between liberalism and fascism, or sometimes liberalism and communism, although note that liberalism's own sort of similarities in some respects to communism means that liberals always prefer to fight a fascist enemy rather than frame the enemy as being communist or being on the left. So these ideological terms wind up giving an almost holy war kind of character to U.S. foreign policy beginning in the 1890s. Now, in putting this out there, I'm not saying that all of America's conflicts from the 1890s onwards were purely ideological and did not have a well-grounded, realistic basis. If you think about World War II, it's actually surprising. The United States doesn't get involved in World War II, doesn't get involved militarily in a direct way until Pearl Harbor. So we're brought into World War II not by our own choice necessarily, but instead by the fact that the Japanese preemptively attack us. And at that point, it is Japan that has declared war on the United States. Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany then declares war on the United States as well, out of their alliance with Japan. It's not the United States which preemptively goes to war with Nazi Germany. The opposite is true. It's actually Germany that goes to war with the United States first, and Germany does it because they were allies with Japan, and Japan had already attacked us. So World War II is not a case of the United States, having these ideological objectives and getting involved out of a sense of sort of pure desire to promote liberalism and democracy around the world. World War II is a defensive war for us. Now, it is certainly a complicated matter if you look at Franklin Roosevelt's policy toward Japan and indeed towards the conflict in Europe before Pearl Harbor. And it's very clear, as indeed it should not be surprising, that President Roosevelt and in general, his administration and much of the U.S. Congress was supportive of England against Japan and England against Nazi Germany as well. So it's not the case that the United States was totally sitting on the sidelines before Pearl Harbor. Nevertheless, World War II is not something we embarked upon in this belief that we were going to make the world safe for democracy. Instead, it was something we had to do after Pearl Harbor because we were under attack, and those attacks were going to continue, and we had to defend ourselves. The best case that can be made on a realistic basis for some of these involvements in things like World War I, for example, is that just as the conservatives in British foreign policy in the 19th century were concerned that if any single power gained total predominance within the European continent, that would then be a superpower or a hyperpower that would be a grave threat to Britain as an island nation off the coast of Europe. Similarly, many Americans have been concerned that if ever you had a single hyperpower that was able to unite Europe and Asia, whether that would be the Soviet Union, or whether it would be Nazi Germany, or potentially, maybe at some point it could be something like communist China. But this fusion of Europe and Asia under a single, hyperpower or, expanded superpower would be something that would be such a concentration of military might, industrial strength, that even the United States might not be, on an even footing with such a, hyperpower. That in fact, the United States itself might then be in some danger simply because of the imbalance of power in the world and the fact that you would have, this union of, the largest continent in the world, Asia, with Europe and all of its advancement, that would be a grave danger. So to some extent, this did inform our outlook both on World War I and on World War II. This idea that perhaps, Germany actually would succeed in creating a hyperpower on the European continent, either under the Kaiser or under Hitler. Even so, this didn't really motivate the United States to get directly involved until a fairly late stage in both conflicts. That in fact, even though both Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt were relatively, internationalist and interventionist presidents, they actually were not as eager to get involved in these conflicts as some of the more extreme voices and ideological voices around them were. Theodore Roosevelt was always much more enthusiastic about getting America involved in foreign conflicts than even people like Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt. And again, Franklin Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were absolutely the farthest things from being restrainers or non-interventionists. But believe it or not, you could actually go beyond them and have people who were even more eager to see America get involved in these massive conflicts. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, and if you've enjoyed this podcast, please hit the like button, and also follow Modern Age on the web at www.modernAgeJournal.com. Modern Age is one of the great conservative publications. It was founded in the 1950s by Russell Kirk, the author of The Conservative Mind, a seminal book that really put conservatism on the map as an intellectual school of thought in the United States. And Modern Age, in the more than 50 years since then, has continued to promote conservatism not just as a political position, but rather as a deeper school of thought. And every weekday on our website at modernagejournal.com, and every 3 months in the pages of our print magazine, you can find the best conservative thinking really anywhere through Modern Age. You can also follow us on Twitter and social media. And of course, once again, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please hit the like button. So what is the Donroe Doctrine? Is the Donroe Doctrine this very funny term, which is a combination, of course, of Donald Trump and Monroe Doctrine? Is it just a reformulation of an ideological kind of impetus for America getting involved in foreign conflicts? Or is it closer in spirit to the original Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which really was quite limited in its aims and was intended to stop the expansion of European power in the New World, and was not intended to create virtuous liberal democratic regimes throughout the Western Hemisphere? Well, it seems to me Donald Trump has been quite restrained in his use of military force, both in his first term and in his second term. Now, he's criticized by some people who think of themselves as restrainers, who say, well, look, Donald Trump took out Soleimani in Iran in his first term. He obviously intervened in the Iran-Israel war in the first year of his second term. Now he has intervened to capture Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela. And so people who are idealistic or ideological restrainers say that this is not acceptable. This is a violation of the principle of restraint, the principle that the United States should not intervene beyond its borders unless there is a massive provocation that we cannot possibly ignore. But Donald Trump is a restrainer of a different kind. He is not an idealistic or utopian or an absolute restrainer. He is a realist. And the theory of political realism, foreign policy realism, doesn't present things in such absolute terms as idealism does. Idealism says that there's right and wrong, and that something like foreign intervention should always be slotted into this framework of whether the intervention is right or wrong. And restrainers and non-interventionists who are idealists say that basically any kind of intervention around the world is always morally wrong, and therefore we should never do it. Realists say that those moral questions are oftentimes sources of confusion rather than clarity, and they often actually cause more trouble than they prevent. A realist simply says, what is our aim? What is in our interest as a country? What are the limits of our power? And how can we best serve our interests as a nation state using the available power that we have without getting drawn into conflicts that are more protracted or that are beyond our control? And so Donald Trump is more of a realist restrainer than an idealist restrainer. He uses power in a quite limited fashion. He seems to understand what the limits of U.S. power are, and he has been effective, at least in terms of his short-term goals, at achieving what he wants to achieve with these interventions in places like Iran and in Venezuela. In the case of the Israel-Iran war, Trump's objective was to bring a conclusion to that war very quickly and to set back or destroy Iran's nuclear program. He succeeded in both of those aims. The war came to a conclusion very swiftly after Donald Trump's intervention, and Iran's nuclear program was certainly very badly damaged, if not utterly destroyed, by Trump's intervention. Now, we can say what's going to happen beyond that. That's an open question. But at least in the short term, in terms of its immediate objectives, Trump correctly calculated how much force was necessary to achieve a clear end. The same is true in Venezuela. Trump decided it was time to remove Maduro from power. He had a number of reasons for doing that, which we'll get into in a few minutes. But having decided to remove Maduro, he basically had an operation planned and executed that was using the minimal amount of force necessary to achieve that end. Not less force, not so little force that it might fail, but enough force that it could succeed very quickly and then not lead to a prolonged standoff. Now, that actually is a very good outcome, even for those of us who are quite skeptical of how much engagement the United States should have in the internal affairs and the regime type of Venezuela. So what I had a concern about was that President Trump would basically have a prolonged standoff with Nicolás Maduro, where the United States would have warships off the coast of Venezuela, we would bombard Venezuela over and over again, and yet that would never serve to dislodge Maduro. And so the situation would just, fester. It would go on for months, if not years. It would be yet another forever war. It would be a low-intensity forever war, but it would be a continual sort of state of low-grade conflict between the United States and Venezuela. But instead, Trump surprised me. He surpassed expectations. Trump used a limited amount of force very quickly. He snatched Maduro. He's brought Maduro to New York for trial. And now Trump has said that there is an olive branch being offered to the regime in Caracas, and that Venezuela has an opportunity now to resolve its conflicts with the United States and for a de-escalation. This is a remarkable change from the kind of foreign policy the U.S. had always pursued under both Presidents Bush, really, but especially the second, George W. Bush. It's a change from the kind of policy that had been pursued under presidents like Barack Obama as well. This actually is President Trump saying, you know what, the primary U.S. interest is not in the kind of regime that may exist in a place like Venezuela. And keep in mind, even with Maduro gone, Venezuela is still under socialist rule. That is still a form of government that we do not like. It's obviously a very bad form of government. It is oppressive of the Venezuelans themselves. But Donald Trump seems to be saying that it is not America's mission to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy and oppressed peoples to redeem and to bring, freedom and democracy and constitutionalism to a foreign land using our military force and our dollars. Trump instead says, you know what, it's for the Venezuelans themselves to sort out what kind of regime and government they're going to have. And we're going to take out someone like Maduro, who is causing problems for us, someone that we think is needs to be on trial in New York. But after that, it really is up to Venezuela what happens next. It is not up to the United States to go in and conduct a thoroughgoing regime change, nation building, and the development of a liberal democracy there. Now, I think Trump is a well-wisher to democracy in Venezuela, just as John Quincy Adams said he was a well-wisher and America wished well to, revolutionary movements that were trying to overthrow Ottoman imperial power. They were trying to bring, freedom and democracy to Greece. That's great. We want to see that happen in Greece in the 19th century and in the 20th century, the 21st century now. We do want to see, freedom and democracy in Venezuela. But it's not our responsibility as a nation to bring about either the liberation and independence of Greece in the 19th century or the establishment of liberal democracy in Venezuela in the 21st century. So the Donroe Doctrine really is quite similar in many ways to the Monroe Doctrine of the 19th century. And that just as the Monroe Doctrine said, it was not our business to go and try to forcibly transform these European colonies into free, democratic, American-style governments in Latin America, that we were willing to accept the existence of European colonies in the New World. We just didn't want to see the expansion of European power in the creation of new colonies and, new wars against colonies that had revolted. Similarly, Donald Trump seems to be saying in the 21st century, we will take out individual dictators and generally put a little bit of military pressure on regimes that are doing things that are against our interests, but we will not, therefore, involve ourselves deeply in the internal politics or in having occupations that are going to try to change the regimes of foreign governments. And, in the Middle East, you've seen Donald Trump express this kind of policy towards Iran. There was a lot of pressure on Donald Trump last year to try to bring about regime change in Iran, not simply to intervene in the Iran-Israel war and try to bring an end to it, but rather to actually try to overthrow the regime of the mullahs, the Islamists within Tehran, and try to bring about some sort of liberalization and democracy in Iran. Trump didn't do that. Trump said, you know what, I'm going to intervene, I'm going to end the war, but I am not going to pursue regime change in Iran. I'm not going to try to use U.S. force to change the government there. He seems to be doing exactly the same thing with respect to Venezuela. So this is not only the Donroe Doctrine, this is basically Donald Trump's overall foreign policy, his way of looking at things. And it is a much more realistic and limited approach to the world than we've seen under previous administrations. Previous administrations had very high moral ideals, which sound much better than this more transactional and realistic, compromising approach that Donald Trump takes. But in practice, when you look at how this high idealism, this attempt to bring about liberalism and democracy in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and elsewhere, when you see how that actually works out in practice, what happens is that when you not only decapitate but try to change and revolutionize a regime, is that you have massive violence break out. You have massive insurgencies, civil wars, instability, chaos take root. That chaos not only leads to enormous amounts of death within and civilian casualties in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya, but what else does it lead to? It leads to this instability, this amount of civil strife, leads to massive refugee flows out of those countries into Europe in the case of the Middle East, and ultimately, of course, much of it winds up coming to the United States as well. So this idealistic policy of promoting good liberal democratic government all around the world actually doesn't promote liberal democratic government. It promotes chaos, it promotes civil war, and it promotes massive refugee flows, which wind up, not only destabilizing Europe, but also ultimately affecting the United States as well. The effect of idealism, the effect of trying to promote liberal democracy all around the world is actually to promote instability and chaos, mass death, and disruption even for the states of Europe and for the United States. Donald Trump is staying away from all of that. He's instead, through the Donroe Doctrine and through his more realistic foreign policy, through his rejection of idealism and regime change, Donald Trump is pursuing much more limited goals and is not creating the kind of conditions of chaos that you might see if you had a much more grandiose foreign policy, a much more moralistic foreign policy. In this, Donald Trump really is returning to the outlook of a James Monroe, to the outlook of a John Quincy Adams. Indeed, he's returning to the outlook of a George Washington. Americans, never intended their revolution and never intended the form of government that we established with the Constitution and through the trials of our early republic. We never intended this as being something that would be imposed upon the rest of the world in a kind of benevolent imperialism. We never thought that, just as Europe had its monarchical colonies, we would now try to export American values and American constitutionalism through the use of force and trying to, establish this everywhere else. Oddly enough, the one place we kind of did try to do that was in Canada. During the American Revolution, we made a few sallies into Canada. We tried to export the American Revolution into Canada. During the War of 1812, of course, we tried to take over Canada. We did this. This was the exception to the general rule that the American revolutionaries and our wise statesmen of the early republic had. This attempt to revolutionize Canada and to bring Canada, the virtues of the U.S. Constitution and our form of liberty. This was done because we thought, hey, the Canadians are just us, right? I mean, you can't distinguish a Canadian from an American, certainly not, at that point, just by looking at them. English Canadians seem, like they ought to be very similar to English Americans. They're both part of this, sort of wider Anglosphere. And so it seemed to a lot of Americans, in the 1770s, and then again, during the War of 1812, that Canada should be an easy place. They're the people who are most similar to us on the entire planet. And therefore, if anyone is going to recognize that, they too can have an American revolution of their own, or they too can be part of America, that the Canadians are ripe for having the American Revolution exported to them. And yet it failed. It failed during the actual American Revolution in the 1770s and 1780s. It fails again during the War of 1812. The Canadians are defined in large part by the fact that they are not Americans. They may speak the same language. They may, in many cases, have the same ancestors as us. Nevertheless, the Canadians are politically defined by the fact that they are not Americans. They have chosen, in critical points in their history to reject being part of America. And therefore, their form of nationalism, basically says, yes, they want to be liberal and democratic, but they want to be liberal and democratic on their terms. They want to maintain, the constitutional connections they have, the monarchy even that they share with Great Britain. They do not want to be part of the American Republic. Now, Trump, of course, does talk about trying to make Canada America's 51st state. But I think it's fair to say that Canada is not about to, Donald Trump is not about to abduct the Prime Minister of Canada. He may have teased Justin Trudeau quite a bit when Trudeau was Prime Minister, but there was nothing like the kind of hostility that existed between, Nicolás Maduro and Donald Trump with respect to Canada's leaders. And it's certainly not true right now under Canada's current Prime Minister Carney. The Donroe Doctrine does not mean that America is going to try once again to revolutionize Canada and, engulf Canada into the American system. It probably doesn't mean anything dramatic for Greenland either. Donald Trump makes a strategic case for the value of Greenland as part of the United States. He makes, a very practical, pragmatic case that Denmark is not capable of defending Greenland if ever Greenland is, under threat. This is why Greenland is currently defended by the United States. But of course, we are defending Greenland, even though Greenland is not ours. Greenland is, part of Denmark. It's not, you could say that it's imperialistic for America to take an interest in Greenland, which is not currently part of our own country. But then again, Greenland is currently run by Denmark, and Greenland is not geographically part of Denmark either. And the Greenlanders, have some objections to being part of Danish rule as well. So it's not really the case that, the Greenland situation is something that involves liberal democracy on the one hand versus imperialism on the other. Greenland really is a very curious case because, of course, it's such a vast piece of real estate with a very small population. That population kind of wants to be independent, actually, of Denmark. Denmark is currently in charge of Greenland. Denmark can't defend Greenland. The United States does defend Greenland, but the United States doesn't really get a say on what happens in Greenland. So that's the situation with Greenland. Again, I think Greenland, for all that Donald Trump talks about it, just as he talks about Canada, really is not part of this wider Donroe Doctrine. The Donroe Doctrine is something that applies to the way we look at Latin America, the Caribbean and South America. It's also something that applies to, in a more broad sense, not necessarily the Donroe Doctrine strictly speaking, but rather Donald Trump's view of foreign policy, and indeed the MAGA view of foreign policy, is that, while we may engage in small-scale interventions for limited goals and carefully calibrate the force that we use to achieve those goals, we will no longer be involved in the kinds of forever wars, prolonged occupations, and futile efforts at nation building and regime change that had characterized U.S. policy from the end of the Cold War until the day before yesterday. So that's a brief overview of where things are going in foreign policy with Donald Trump. He's been very successful so far. Of course, the great question is what happens next? Are you ultimately going to have tensions reemerge with Venezuela, with Iran, with, perhaps other hotspots? Will Donald Trump be drawn into trying to solve these problems in a more permanent way through a greater degree of interventionism? And will that then simply lead back to the same sorts of problems that we've had with Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and so many other places, or under the older dispensation of George W. Bush and indeed Democratic presidents who are also interventionists? It seems to me that Donald Trump will continue to use force only in a limited way, and he will use it to teach a lesson to regimes that he doesn't necessarily try to change or replace, but rather that he wants to re-incentivize. He wants to incentivize regimes that may be hostile to the United States to think twice about doing things that are against our interests, and instead to be more willing to cooperate, to strike deals, and to be more compliant with the United States. So even if you have continuing tensions with Iran and with Venezuela, as indeed you do, I do not think that that means Donald Trump is on a course for a larger scale intervention in either country. Now, there is, of course, course, then a question beyond Trump's own years. So after 2029, we will have a new president. Will that president be someone who follows in the strategy that has been set down by President Trump? Will it be someone who wants to revert to the strategy perhaps of the Bush-era Republican Party? Will it be someone who's a progressive and who wants to adopt, the foreign policy of a Bill Clinton or a Barack Obama? It seems to me that Donald Trump's successes are a great contrast with the failures of the Clinton era and also of the Bush era. By the way, Bill Clinton is sometimes wrongly presented as a successful foreign policy president, but of course it was under Donald Trump that the conditions which ultimately it was under Bill Clinton in the 1990s, under which the conditions that ultimately lead to the 9/11 attacks early in the George W. Bush administration in 2001 take place. So Bill Clinton failed to deal with the real problem of al-Qaeda, and as a result, you had a set of conditions which then lead to the horrific attacks of 9/11 in 2001. That's a failure certainly of George W. Bush, who was actually president during the 9/11 attacks, but it was also a failure of Bill Clinton before him in creating conditions that led up to them. Donald Trump so far has been much more successful. And the question now, will future presidents be able to build upon that success and create a new vision for America in the 21st century that is closer to the vision of our founding fathers and to great statesmen like John Quincy Adams and James Monroe in foreign policy? Or are we going to revert to the follies of a more ideological foreign policy that was pursued from 1890 onwards? I'm very hopeful that the Trump administration has now inaugurated a return to realism in U.S. foreign policy and a rejection of the excesses of idealism.